Hi, I'm Sofia Martinez. I'm 30 years old. 6 months ago, I discovered my stepmother Victoria had sold every piece of my deceased mother's jewelry collection for pocket change at a pawn shop in downtown Phoenix. Her face went white as a sheet when I told her what each piece was actually worth. My mother's costume jewelry turned out to be worth $2.3 million. Victoria had sold a rare 1920s Cartier necklace for $50, a Tiffany emerald ring from 1965 for $75, and the antique pearl earrings that belonged to my great-grandmother Elena, $25 at Murphy's Cash and Pawn on Roosevelt Street. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was discovering why my mother Isabella never told anyone about the real value. Each piece wasn't just jewelry, they were insurance policies, emergency funds, and her way of protecting our future after she was gone. She'd been quietly collecting these pieces for 20 years, researching their provenance at the Arizona State Library, getting them authenticated at Sotheby's in New York, building a safety net she planned to pass down to me when I turned 35. Victoria didn't just sell jewelry. She sold my inheritance, my mother's legacy, and 20 years of secret sacrifice. But here's what Victoria Blackwood didn't know, and what changed everything. Every single transaction was illegal under Arizona probate law. My mother had left detailed documentation, authenticity certificates, and a safety deposit box at Wells Fargo full of evidence that proved those pieces were worth a fortune. What time are you hearing this story? Are you at work, in your car, lying in bed? Drop a comment below because I read every single one and I want to know who's listening while I tell you how one phone call to Christie's auction house turned my grief into the biggest legal battle of my stepmother's life. She wanted my mother's memory erased. Instead, I gave her a federal fraud investigation she'll never forget. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. It was March 15th, a Tuesday morning that started like any other day in Scottsdale. I was sitting in my apartment on Camelback Road, drinking coffee and scrolling through estate sale listings, something I'd been doing obsessively since my mother died 8 months earlier. Not because I needed anything, but because it kept me connected to her somehow. She loved finding hidden treasures, pieces with stories. That's when I saw it. A listing for vintage costume jewelry lot, various pieces on estatesales.net. The thumbnail photo was blurry, but something about one of the necklaces made my stomach drop. It looked exactly like the Art Deco piece my mother wore to every important event in my life. My high school graduation, my college commencement, my first job interview. She called it her confidence necklace, said it made her feel like she could conquer the world. I clicked on the photo to enlarge it, and my hands started shaking. It wasn't just similar, it was identical, down to the tiny chip in the third emerald that happened when I accidentally knocked it off her dresser when I was 12. I scrolled through the other photos, and with each image, my heart sank deeper. The pearl bracelet she wore to church every Sunday, the ruby brooch that had been pinned to her wedding dress, the sapphire earrings she saved for New Year's Eve. Every single piece of jewelry my mother had owned was sitting in some stranger's estate sale, labeled as costume jewelry with starting bids of $5 to $25. My mother's entire collection, pieces she'd treasured, pieces she'd told me had sentimental value, was being sold off like garage sale leftovers. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to the estate sale address on East Indian School Road. The house was a modest ranch-style home, nothing fancy, but the driveway was packed with cars. Inside, people were rifling through boxes of what the family was calling cheap jewelry. I watched in horror as strangers held up my mother's pieces, laughing about how gaudy they were, how old-fashioned the settings looked. I found the seller, a middle-aged man named Robert Chen, and asked him where he'd gotten the jewelry. He pulled out a receipt from Murphy's Cash and Pawn. "Bought in all as a lot last month," he said. "Lady needed quick cash, sold me about 40 pieces for $500 total. Figured I could flip them at estate sales." My blood ran cold. 40 pieces. That was exactly how many pieces my mother had in her jewelry box. I drove straight to Murphy's Cash and Pawn, a rundown shop in a strip mall that smelled like cigarettes and desperation. The owner, a gruff man with arms covered in tattoos, barely looked up when I walked in. Yeah, I remember her, he said when I described Victoria. Desperate-looking blonde, probably 50-something. Said she needed money fast, husband's medical bills or something. Brought in a whole shoebox full of old jewelry. Looked like stuff from the 70s and 80s, nothing special. Nothing special. That's what he called my mother's collection, pieces she'd spent decades carefully selecting and preserving. I asked to see the paperwork. Victoria had signed everything as Victoria Blackwood Martinez, using my mother's last name, which she had no legal right to. She'd listed the address as my mother's house on North 32nd Street, the house that was now sitting empty in probate court. But here's where it gets really twisted. When I asked the pawnshop owner what Victoria had said about the jewelry's origin, he shrugged. Said it belonged to her deceased mother-in-law. Said the old lady had bad taste, and it was all fake anyway. I felt sorry for her, you know? Losing family is hard. Gave her a fair price for costume stuff. $500 cash, no questions asked.
Costume stuff. My mother's treasures, reduced to costume stuff by the woman who'd married my father just 2 years before my mother's cancer diagnosis. The woman who'd moved into our house, slept in our guest bedroom, and smiled sympathetically at the funeral while secretly planning to rob my mother's grave. I sat in my car outside that pawn shop and called my friend Marcus, who works as a jewelry appraiser downtown. Marcus, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, if someone had a 1920s Cartier necklace, Art Deco style, emeralds and diamonds, what would something like that be worth? He whistled low. Sophia, pieces like that, if they're authentic, we're talking 6 figures minimum, maybe more if the provenance is solid. Why? That's when everything clicked. My mother hadn't been collecting pretty things all those years. She'd been building an investment portfolio in jewelry form. I remembered how she'd disappear for entire Saturdays, claiming she was running errands, how she'd come home with small packages that she'd tuck away in her bedroom, how she'd spend hours at the library, checking out books on antiques and jewelry history. I remembered the trips to New York when I was in college. She said she was visiting old friends, but now I realized she'd been going to auction houses, getting pieces authenticated, building relationships with experts. All those boring errands were actually careful, methodical research. My mother had been a secret collector, and apparently a brilliant one. But why keep it secret? Why not tell my father? Why not tell me? I drove home with these questions spinning in my head, and that's when I remembered something that made my blood run cold: the safety deposit box. 2 weeks after the funeral, Victoria had mentioned that my mother had a safety deposit box at Wells Fargo on Central Avenue. Probably just important papers, Victoria had said dismissively. I'll handle clearing it out. At the time, I was too grief-stricken to think about it. But now, sitting in my driveway, I realized Victoria had never mentioned that box again. I called Wells Fargo immediately. I need to access my mother's safety deposit box, I told them. The representative, a kind woman named Janet, pulled up the account. I'm sorry, Miss Martinez, but that box was already cleared out 3 months ago. Victoria Blackwood presented a power of attorney documents and removed all contents. 3 months ago, just 5 months after my mother's death, Victoria had cleaned out that box while I was still struggling to get out of bed each morning, still wearing my mother's sweaters because they smelled like her perfume. While I was grieving, Victoria was systematically erasing every trace of my mother's secret life. Do you keep records of what was removed? I asked Janet, though I already knew the answer. I'm sorry, we don't inventory personal items, but I can tell you there were several manila envelopes and what looked like documentation. The woman seemed to know exactly what she was looking for. Of course she did. Victoria had probably been watching my mother for months before she died, figuring out her routines, her secrets, her hiding places. My mother, weak from chemo, and trusting the woman she thought was helping care for our family, had probably even told Victoria about the box, thinking she was preparing her to help me handle things after she was gone. I hung up the phone and screamed. Actually screamed, right there in my Honda Civic in my apartment complex parking lot. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson from Unit 12B, knocked on my window. "Honey, are you okay?" she asked. I looked at her kind, worried face and started laughing. Hysterical, broken laughter that scared us both. "No," I told her, "I'm not okay.
My stepmother stole my inheritance and sold it to a pawn shop for drug money. Mrs. Patterson's eyes went wide. She didn't know about Victoria's little OxyContin problem that started after her back surgery last year. But I'd noticed the pills disappearing from my mother's cancer prescriptions. I'd noticed Victoria's mood swings, her sudden need for cash, her nervous energy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the signs I'd missed. Victoria's eagerness to help clean out my mother's closet, her insistence that we didn't need to go through everything carefully, her suggestion that we donate my mother's old jewelry to charity rather than keep it. "You don't wear that style anyway, Sophia," she'd said. "Your mother would want it to go to someone who'd appreciate it." Appreciate it. She'd convinced me to let her handle donating jewelry worth over $2 million to Goodwill. Except she'd never donated it. She'd sold it to feed her addiction and pay off whatever debts she'd racked up gambling at Talking Stick Resort, where my father had mentioned seeing charges on their joint credit card. The next morning, I called in sick to my job at Desert Financial Credit Union and drove straight to the Maricopa County Recorder's office. If my mother had been as methodical about her collection as I suspected, there would be a paper trail. Insurance records, appraisal documents, something that proved the true value of what Victoria had stolen. And that's when I found it. Not at the recorder's office, but in the most obvious place I should have looked first, my mother's bedroom. In the house that was sitting empty while probate court sorted out the estate. I still had keys. Victoria had never bothered to change the locks, probably because she thought she'd already taken everything of value.
The house felt like a tomb. Victoria had stripped it of anything remotely valuable, but she'd left the furniture, the photos, the everyday items that made it look like someone still lived there. My mother's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen counter next to a romance novel she'd never finished. Her coffee mug was still in the sink, unwashed, because I hadn't been able to bring myself to clean it. I went straight to her bedroom and started searching systematically. Victoria had cleared out the obvious places, the jewelry box, the dresser drawers, the closet shelves, but my mother was smarter than that. I remembered how she used to hide Christmas presents when I was a kid, how she'd find the most unexpected places, the bottom of the laundry hamper, inside old shoe boxes, taped to the underside of furniture. And there it was, taped to the bottom of her vanity drawer, a key I'd never seen before. Small, brass, with numbers engraved on the head. 2847, another safety deposit box. This time, I didn't call ahead. I drove straight to Desert Schools Federal Credit Union on Thomas Road, the bank where my mother had done her personal banking for 30 years. I walked up to the customer service desk, key in hand, and asked to access box 2847. The representative, a young man named David, looked up the account and frowned. "Ma'am, this box is registered under Isabella Martinez and Sofia Martinez. You're listed as the secondary holder, but you'll need 2 forms of ID and—" I was already pulling out my driver's license and passport. My mother had planned for this. She'd made sure I could access this box without probate court, without lawyers, without Victoria. David led me to the vault, his key ring jingling as we walked through the secure area. Box 2847 was larger than I expected, one of the bigger sizes available. David inserted his key, I inserted mine, and the metal door swung open to reveal a treasure trove that took my breath away. Manila folders, dozens of them, each labeled in my mother's careful handwriting. Cartier necklace, authentication and appraisal. Tiffany ring, purchase receipt and valuation. Great-grandmother's pearls, estate documentation. Every single piece of jewelry Victoria had sold was documented here. Purchase receipts, authentication certificates from Sotheby's and Christie's, professional appraisals updated annually, insurance valuations, even historical research on the previous owners. But that wasn't all. At the bottom of the box was a thick manila envelope labeled "For Sophia, open after my death." Inside was a handwritten letter on my mother's personal stationery, dated just 2 weeks before she passed away. "My dearest Sophia," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I pray that you found this box easily. I have so much to explain, and I hope you'll understand why I kept this secret from everyone, including your father." I stood there in that sterile bank vault, surrounded by the evidence of my mother's secret life, and read the letter that would change everything.
She explained how she'd started collecting jewelry as a young woman, how she'd learned to spot valuable pieces at estate sales and auctions, how she'd built this collection piece by piece over 20 years, not as a hobby, but as an insurance policy. "Your father is a wonderful man," she wrote, "but he's never been good with money. I love him, but I've watched him make impulsive decisions, invest in get-rich-quick schemes, trust the wrong people. I knew that if anything happened to me, you'd need something secure, something that couldn't be gambled away or lost in a bad business deal. This collection is your future, Sophia, your security, your freedom." She went on to explain the authentication process, the relationships she'd built with auction houses, the insurance policies she'd maintained. Every piece was documented, insured, and legally mine through a trust she'd established without my father's knowledge. "I know this seems secretive," she wrote, "but I needed to protect this for you. I've seen too many widows left with nothing because their husbands made poor financial decisions. This way, no matter what happens, you'll have options." The letter was 3 pages long, detailing not just the jewelry collection, but her hopes for my future. "Use this to buy a house," she wrote, "start a business, travel the world, go back to school. Whatever you choose, you'll have the freedom to choose it. That's all any mother wants for her daughter, freedom to make her own choices." I was crying by the time I finished reading, standing there in that vault with my mother's final gift spread out before me. But my tears weren't just from grief. They were from rage, pure, white-hot fury at the woman who had stolen not just jewelry, but my mother's final act of love. Victoria hadn't just robbed me of valuable objects, she'd robbed me of my mother's legacy, her sacrifice, her dream of giving me freedom. I carefully photographed every document, every appraisal, every receipt. The numbers were staggering. The Cartier necklace alone was appraised at $340,000. The Tiffany ring, $180,000. The complete collection, according to the most recent appraisal from just 6 months before my mother's death, $2.3 million.
Victoria had sold my future for $500 in cash to support her drug habit, but she'd made one critical mistake. She had no idea this documentation existed. She thought she'd covered her tracks by clearing out the other safety deposit box, by sweet-talking the pawn shop owner, by convincing me to let her handle the worthless costume jewelry. But my mother had been smarter than all of us. She'd protected her secret with bank-level security, legal documentation, and a paper trail that would stand up in any court in the country. Victoria thought she was stealing from a dead woman and her grieving daughter. What she'd actually done was commit grand larceny, fraud, and theft against a carefully documented estate worth millions. I walked out of that bank holding evidence that would destroy Victoria's life. But I wasn't just angry anymore. I was methodical, strategic. I finally understood where I'd gotten those traits, from my mother, the woman who'd spent 20 years quietly building a fortune while everyone around her assumed she was just collecting pretty things. Victoria wanted to erase my mother's memory, reduce her to a footnote in her own husband's life. Instead, she'd given me the motivation to honor my mother's true legacy. The woman who'd been smart enough to build a secret fortune was about to get the justice she deserved. And Victoria Blackwood was about to learn that some things can't be stolen, sold, or silenced. She thought she was dealing with a grieving daughter. She had no idea she'd just declared war on my mother's child. But the jewelry theft wasn't where Victoria's betrayal started. It was just the grand finale of a 2-year campaign to erase my mother from her own life. See, I thought the worst thing Victoria had done was sell my inheritance. I was wrong. The worst thing she'd done was convince my dying mother that she was alone. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment Victoria Blackwood walked into our lives like a wolf in designer clothing. It was October 2021, and my mother had just finished her first round of chemotherapy at Banner MD Anderson Cancer Center on McDowell Road. She was weak, losing her hair, and scared, but still fighting, still hopeful. My father, David Martinez, had been struggling. He'd never been good at handling crisis, and watching the woman he'd loved for 32 years waste away was destroying him.
He'd started staying late at his accounting firm, Martinez and Associates, claiming he had client emergencies that couldn't wait. But I knew the truth. He couldn't bear to watch my mother suffer, so he was running away from it. That's when Victoria appeared. She was a client at his firm, a recent divorcee who needed help organizing her finances after a messy split from her ex-husband in Tucson. Blonde, well-dressed, articulate, and most importantly, she didn't smell like hospitals and fear. She smelled like expensive perfume and possibility. My mother noticed the change in my father immediately. He started coming home earlier, whistling while he made coffee, actually engaging in conversations instead of staring at his phone. Victoria brought some perspective to my day, he'd tell my mother. She's been through hell with her divorce, but she's so positive about the future. It's refreshing. Refreshing. That's what he called another woman while his wife was fighting for her life. My mother never said anything, but I caught her watching him sometimes with this look of quiet devastation, like she was watching her marriage dissolve in real time and was too sick to fight for it. By December, Victoria was dropping by the house. Just checking on everyone, she'd say, bringing casseroles and offering to help with errands. My mother, raised to be polite even when she was dying, would thank her graciously. "She's very thoughtful," she'd tell me. "Your father needs support right now, and I can't give him what I used to give him." What I used to give him. My mother was already talking about herself in past tense, already accepting that she was being replaced. And Victoria was making sure that replacement happened as smoothly as possible. The first real red flag came during Christmas 2021. My mother had always been the one to decorate our house on North 32nd Street. Every year since I was born, she'd spend an entire weekend transforming our home into a winter wonderland. Hand-strung popcorn garlands, carefully arranged nativity scenes, stockings she'd embroidered herself, hanging from the mantel. But that December, she was too weak from her treatments to do much more than sit on the couch and direct. "The angel goes on top," she'd whisper to me as I struggled with the Christmas tree. "The blue ornaments go near the window. They catch the light better there." That's when Victoria showed up with 3 shopping bags full of new decorations, modern, expensive-looking ornaments in silver and white. "I thought I'd help freshen things up," she announced, already unpacking her purchases. "Some of these older decorations look a little dated." Dated. She was calling my mother's handmade Christmas memories dated. But the worst part was my father's reaction. Instead of defending 30 years of Christmas traditions, he smiled. "Victoria has great taste," he said, watching her replace my mother's carefully chosen ornaments with generic store-bought alternatives. My mother sat there on the couch, wrapped in the quilt her own mother had made, and watched a stranger redecorate her Christmas tree. She didn't say a word, but I saw her hands tighten around that quilt, and I saw the exact moment she realized she was being erased from her own home. By January 2022, Victoria had a key to our house. "For emergencies," my father explained, "in case something happens while I'm at work and your mother needs help." But Victoria didn't just show up for emergencies. She showed up every day, making herself coffee in our kitchen, reorganizing our cabinets, offering unsolicited advice about everything from my mother's medication schedule to the outdated furniture in the living room. "This couch has seen better days," Victoria would say, running her hands over the burgundy sofa my parents had bought for their 10th anniversary. "David, you should really consider updating the living room. Something more contemporary would brighten the whole space." She'd look at my mother apologetically. "I hope I'm not overstepping. I just want everyone to be comfortable." Overstepping. She was systematically replacing my mother's choices, my mother's taste, my mother's presence in her own home, and she called it not overstepping. My mother, too sick to fight and too kind to cause conflict, would just nod. "Victoria has lovely ideas," she'd say later, when it was just the 2 of us. But I could hear the defeat in her voice. The pattern became clear by February. Victoria would suggest changes: new curtains, different artwork, updated kitchen accessories. My father, grateful for any input that didn't come from his sick wife, would agree immediately. Within days, my mother's choices would disappear, replaced by Victoria's vision of what our home should look like. But it wasn't just decorating. Victoria started inserting herself into every aspect of our family routine. She'd show up during my mother's doctor appointments, claiming she was providing support, while actually grilling the oncologist about treatment costs and insurance coverage. She'd volunteer to pick up prescriptions, then return with detailed questions about my mother's prognosis. "I just want to understand what we're dealing with," she'd tell my father, always making sure to use the word "we" when discussing my mother's health, as if she were part of our family, as if my mother's cancer was her burden to bear. I started keeping notes, not consciously at first, just random observations I'd text to my best friend Melissa about the weird woman who was taking over our house. But by March, those texts had become a detailed record of Victoria's systematic infiltration of our lives. March 3rd. Victoria rearranged Mom's bedroom while she was at chemo, said she was organizing, but moved all of Mom's personal photos to a drawer. March 10th. Found Victoria going through Mom's jewelry box today. She said she was helping inventory valuable items for insurance purposes. Mom never asked her to do that. March 17th. Victoria convinced Dad to switch Mom's care to a different oncologist, one that's cheaper but farther away. Mom didn't want to change doctors, but was too tired to argue. March 24th. Victoria threw away all of Mom's old magazines and books because they were cluttering the nightstand. Those are Mom's comfort reading during treatments. Looking back at those texts now, I can see the pattern I missed then. Victoria wasn't just helping a sick woman. She was systematically dismantling my mother's life, piece by piece, preparing for the day when she could step into the space my mother had occupied. But the most insidious part was how she made my mother complicit in her own erasure. Victoria had a gift for framing her takeover as helpful gestures. She wasn't redecorating our house, she was brightening things up for Isabella's recovery. She wasn't interrogating doctors, she was making sure Isabella gets the best care possible. She wasn't going through personal belongings, she was organizing things to reduce Isabella's stress. And my mother, already feeling like a burden because of her illness, was grateful, actually grateful, to the woman who was methodically replacing her in her own life. "Victoria is such a blessing," she'd tell me. "I don't know how your father would cope without her support." The breaking point came in April 2022. My mother had been having a good week. Her energy was up, her appetite had returned, and she'd even talked about replanting her garden for the summer. I found her in the backyard on a Saturday morning, kneeling in the dirt with her hands full of seeds, looking more like herself than she had in months. That's when Victoria arrived for her daily check-in, saw my mother gardening, and immediately launched into concern mode. "Isabella, honey, should you be doing that? The doctor said you need to avoid exposure to bacteria in soil. What if you get an infection?" My mother looked up confused. "Dr. Chen never said anything about avoiding gardening. This is good exercise for me." But Victoria was already pulling out her phone. "Let me call David," she said. "He's worried about you overexerting yourself." Within 10 minutes, my father was racing home from his Saturday golf game, convinced that my mother was having some kind of health crisis because she'd decided to plant tomatoes. "Victoria was right to call," he told my mother, gently but firmly taking the gardening tools from her hands. "You need to be more careful. We can't risk any setbacks right now." My mother looked from him to Victoria, who was standing there with this expression of manufactured concern, and I saw something die in her eyes. Not hope, she'd already lost most of that, but agency, the last bit of control she had over her own life. That was the day my mother stopped making decisions about anything. What to wear, what to eat, which TV shows to watch, when to take her medications. Everything became Victoria's domain, with my father's enthusiastic approval. "Victoria knows what's best," became his default response to any question about my mother's care or preferences. By May, Victoria was essentially living in our house. She had clothes in the guest bedroom, toiletries in the guest bathroom, and food preferences that somehow took priority over my mother's. "Isabella can't keep much down anyway," Victoria would say when preparing meals. "I'll make something nutritious that everyone can enjoy." Translation, she'd cook what she wanted to eat, and my mother could survive on crackers and ginger ale. But the most heartbreaking change was how my mother started asking permission for everything. Permission to call her friends, permission to watch her favorite shows, permission to wear her own jewelry. "Do you think it's okay if I put on the pearl earrings?" she asked me one day. "Victoria thinks they're too formal for daytime, but they make me feel pretty." Too formal for daytime? My mother was asking permission to wear her own jewelry because Victoria had convinced her that her taste was wrong, her instincts were wrong, her choices were wrong. My dying mother was apologizing for wanting to feel pretty in her own house. That's when I started fighting back. Not effectively. I was 29 years old, working full-time at the credit union, and spending every free moment either at the hospital or trying to support my parents. But I started questioning Victoria's suggestions, challenging her helpful interference, and making it clear that I didn't appreciate her constant presence. Victoria's response was swift and calculated. She started having private conversations with my father about my attitude problem. I was being difficult during a stressful time. I was making things harder for everyone with my resistance to help. I was clearly struggling to cope with my mother's illness and maybe needed professional counseling to deal with my anger. My father, overwhelmed and grateful for Victoria's support, believed every word. "Sophia, I know this is hard," he told me after one particularly tense family dinner, "but Victoria is just trying to help. Your hostility toward her is putting additional stress on your mother. Can't you just try to be more cooperative?" Cooperative. I was being asked to cooperate with my mother's replacement, to smile and be grateful while watching Victoria systematically take over every aspect of my mother's life. To pretend it was normal that a woman who'd known our family for less than a year was making decisions about my mother's medical care, daily routine, and living arrangements. But the worst part was that my mother started defending Victoria against me. "She's been so helpful, Sophia," she'd say whenever I complained about Victoria's intrusions. "I don't know what we would have done without her. Please don't make this harder than it already is." Don't make this harder. My mother was asking me not to fight for her because she'd already accepted that she was being replaced. Victoria had convinced a dying woman that her replacement was an act of charity, not conquest, that my mother should be grateful for the woman who was stealing her life. June brought another escalation. Victoria announced that she'd found a wonderful assisted living facility where my mother could receive professional care while my father focused on rebuilding his life. Sunrise Senior Living in Paradise Valley. Expensive, luxurious, and 45 minutes away from our house. "It's not permanent," Victoria explained to my mother, showing her glossy brochures filled with smiling elderly people playing bingo and doing water aerobics. "Just until you're stronger. David needs time to process everything that's happened, and you need professional support that we can't provide at home." Professional support? Victoria was convincing my mother that her own family wasn't capable of caring for her, that she needed to be institutionalized for everyone's benefit. And she was doing it with such compassion, such apparent concern for my mother's well-being, that my father was nodding along enthusiastically. "It would give you some relief," my mother told my father quietly. "I know this is hard on you. Maybe some space would be good for both of us." She was agreeing to her own exile because Victoria had convinced her it was an act of love. That night, I had the biggest fight of my adult life with my father. I accused him of abandoning my mother. He accused me of being selfish and unrealistic about her needs. Victoria, of course, positioned herself as the peacemaker, the reasonable voice in the middle of our emotional chaos. "I understand why Sophia is upset," she told my father, speaking about me like I wasn't standing right there. "She's watching her mother decline, and it's natural to want to deny that professional care might be necessary. But we have to think about what's best for Isabella, not what makes us feel better about ourselves." What makes us feel better about ourselves? Victoria had turned my desire to keep my mother at home into selfishness, my opposition to assisted living into denial, my fight for my mother's autonomy into emotional dysfunction. She'd made caring about my mother seem pathological. Fortunately, the decision was made for us. In July, my mother's health took a turn for the worse, and her oncologist recommended hospice care. At home. She'll be most comfortable in familiar surroundings, Dr. Chen explained, with family nearby, in her own space, with her own things around her.
Her own things. Except by that point, very few of our house's contents were actually my mother's things anymore. Victoria's redecorating project had been so thorough that my mother was essentially a guest in a house that had once reflected her personality, her choices, her life. But hospice care meant nurses, social workers, and medical professionals who were focused solely on my mother's comfort and dignity. People who hadn't been manipulated by Victoria's helpful persona, who could see the situation with fresh eyes. And they noticed things, like the fact that my mother's personal belongings had been moved to the smallest bedroom in the house, while Victoria's things occupied the master suite's walk-in closet. Like the fact that family photos featuring my mother had been replaced with generic artwork. Like the fact that Victoria was making medical decisions without consulting my mother's actual wishes. Mrs. Martinez, the hospice social worker, Janet Rodriguez, asked my mother during her intake assessment, "Can you show me where you keep your personal items, your jewelry, your important papers, things that bring you comfort?" My mother looked around the room helplessly. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Victoria organized everything. She'll know where things are." She'll know where things are. My mother had become so disconnected from her own possessions that she didn't know where her personal belongings were located in her own house. Victoria's organization had been so complete that my mother no longer had access to her own life. Janet Rodriguez had seen this before. "It's not uncommon," she told me privately, "for dying people to become isolated from their personal belongings when well-meaning helpers take over. But it's important for your mother to be surrounded by meaningful objects during this time, things that remind her of her life, her relationships, her identity." Her identity. That was the word that finally made everything click. Victoria hadn't just been redecorating our house or organizing our routines, she'd been systematically erasing my mother's identity, replacing it with her own vision of what our family should look like. By the time my mother was actively dying, she'd been so thoroughly erased from her own life that she couldn't even locate her personal belongings. I spent the next week reversing 2 years of Victoria's improvements. I brought my mother's favorite quilt back to the master bedroom. I returned her family photos to the living room. I found her jewelry box in the garage, buried under boxes of Christmas decorations, and brought it back to her dresser where it belonged. But the most heartbreaking discovery was a shoebox hidden in the back of my mother's closet behind clothes that Victoria had deemed too outdated to keep visible. Inside were greeting cards, letters, and small mementos that my mother had apparently been hiding from Victoria's organizing efforts. Birthday cards from friends Victoria had discouraged from visiting. Photos of family vacations Victoria had called clutter. Even pressed flowers from her garden, flowers she'd saved before Victoria convinced my father that gardening was too dangerous for someone with cancer. My mother had been hiding pieces of her own life in her own house, keeping fragments of her identity secret from the woman who'd convinced everyone she was just trying to help. Even while dying, my mother had been fighting to preserve some small part of who she was, hiding it away like contraband in her own bedroom. Victoria's reaction to my restoration project was immediate and intense. "Sophia, you're upsetting your mother by bringing back all this old clutter," she told my father. "The house was finally organized and peaceful, and now you're disrupting her environment during a very sensitive time." But my mother's reaction told a different story. When I brought her jewelry box back to her dresser, she cried. Actually cried tears of relief. "I thought it was gone," she whispered, running her fingers over the familiar wooden box. "Victoria said it would be safer in storage, but I missed seeing it every morning." Safer in storage?
Victoria had convinced my dying mother that her most precious possessions weren't safe in her own bedroom. She'd banished my mother's jewelry to the garage while filling the master bedroom with her own belongings. She'd made my mother feel like a stranger in her own home, someone whose things were so worthless they belonged with the holiday decorations and old tax returns. Those final weeks with my mother were a revelation. Surrounded by her own belongings, wearing her own jewelry, looking at her own photos, she seemed more like herself than she had in months. She told me stories about pieces in her collection I'd never heard before. The pearl necklace her mother had worn to my parents' wedding, the sapphire ring my father had bought her for their 25th anniversary, the emerald bracelet she'd found at an estate sale in Sedona and had authenticated at a local jewelry shop. Each piece has a story, she told me, holding up a delicate gold chain with a small diamond pendant. This was my first real jewelry purchase after you were born. I wanted something beautiful to mark the beginning of my life as your mother, something I could pass down to you someday.
Pass down to me. My mother had been thinking about legacy, about preserving family history through her jewelry collection. But Victoria had sold those pieces as costume jewelry to a pawn shop for drug money. She'd destroyed not just valuable objects, but the stories, the memories, the generational connections my mother had been carefully preserving. My mother died on August 15, 2022, surrounded by her own belongings, wearing her favorite earrings, holding my hand while we looked through photo albums filled with memories Victoria had tried to erase. Her final weeks had been peaceful because she'd been allowed to be herself, in her own space, connected to her own life. But even at the funeral, Victoria was already positioning herself as the grieving widow's replacement. She stood next to my father during the service, accepted condolences like she was family, and made sure everyone knew how helpful she'd been during my mother's difficult final months. I don't know what David would have done without Victoria, people kept saying. She was such a blessing during such a hard time. And I wanted to scream. She wasn't a blessing. She was a predator who'd spent 2 years systematically replacing a dying woman in her own life. But I didn't scream. I grieved quietly, privately, while watching Victoria seamlessly transition from helpful family friend to my father's new partner. Within 3 months of my mother's death, Victoria had moved her belongings from the guest bedroom to the master suite. By Christmas 2022, she was signing holiday cards as David and Victoria Martinez. Martinez. She'd taken my mother's last name, moved into my mother's bedroom, and was using my mother's social circle as her own. She'd completed the identity theft she'd been working on for 2 years. My mother was dead, and Victoria Blackwood had successfully become the new Mrs. Martinez. Except she'd made one crucial mistake. In all her careful planning, all her methodical erasure of my mother's identity, she'd never bothered to find out about the secret life my mother had built through her jewelry collection. Victoria thought she'd stolen everything of value when she cleared out that safety deposit box and sold those pieces to the pawn shop. She had no idea that my mother had been 10 steps ahead of her the entire time, that every piece of jewelry Victoria sold had been documented, authenticated, and legally protected through a trust that Victoria couldn't access, couldn't break, and couldn't steal from. My mother had spent 2 years watching Victoria systematically erase her from her own life, but she'd also spent those 2 years protecting the one thing Victoria would never think to look for, the secret fortune that would ensure her daughter's future even after Victoria had destroyed everything else. Victoria thought she'd won the game. She had my father, my mother's house, my mother's name, and what she believed was my mother's complete capitulation to her authority. But my mother had been playing a different game entirely, a longer game, a smarter game. And now it was my turn to play. Standing in that bank vault with my mother's secret documentation spread before me, I realized I had a choice. I could be the grieving daughter Victoria expected, quiet, defeated, easy to manipulate. Or I could be my mother's daughter, strategic, methodical, and absolutely ruthless when protecting what mattered. I chose to be my mother's daughter.
The first call I made was to Catherine Williams at Goldberg, Williams & Associates, the most aggressive civil litigation firm in Phoenix. Catherine had a reputation for destroying people who thought they were untouchable. Corporate executives, corrupt politicians, anyone who believed their money and connections made them immune to consequences. Perfect for what I had planned. Ms. Martinez, Catherine said after I'd explained the situation, what you're describing isn't just theft. It's systematic elder abuse, financial exploitation, and fraud on a scale that qualifies for federal prosecution. How quickly can you get me those documents? Within 2 hours, I was sitting in Catherine's downtown office with copies of every appraisal, every authentication certificate, every piece of evidence my mother had carefully preserved. Catherine's paralegal, Marcus Chen, spread the documents across the conference table like a war map. $2.3 million, Catherine said, reviewing the appraisals, sold for $500, and your stepmother had no legal authority to access or sell any of these items. She looked up at me with the kind of smile that probably made opposing attorneys wake up in cold sweats. Sophia, your mother built us an absolutely bulletproof case. Victoria Blackwood just committed the kind of fraud that ends with federal prison time. But I wasn't satisfied with just getting Victoria arrested. I wanted her destroyed the same way she'd destroyed my mother. Systematically, publicly, completely. I want more than criminal charges, I told Catherine. I want civil damages. I want her assets seized. I want everyone who enabled this to face consequences. And I want it all to be public. Catherine's smile got wider. Now you're speaking my language. The second call was to James Morrison, an investigative journalist at the Arizona Republic who specialized in exposing elder abuse and financial fraud. James had been writing about these kinds of cases for 15 years, and he had a particular hatred for people who preyed on dying seniors.
I've seen a lot of horrible things, James told me after reviewing the evidence, but this is next-level sociopathic behavior. Your stepmother didn't just steal from you. She psychologically tortured a dying woman for 2 years, then robbed her grave. This story is going to make people furious. Furious was exactly what I wanted. The third call was to Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in elder abuse cases. I needed expert testimony that could explain Victoria's pattern of behavior, her manipulation tactics, and the psychological damage she'd inflicted on my mother. What you're describing is called predatory relationship fraud, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Your stepmother identified a vulnerable family, inserted herself during a crisis, then systematically isolated and exploited her victim. The jewelry theft was just the final step in a 2-year campaign of psychological and financial abuse. By the end of that first week, I had assembled what Catherine called the dream team of righteous fury. A litigation attorney known for destroying fraudsters, a journalist who specialized in exposing elder abusers, and a psychiatrist who could explain exactly how Victoria had manipulated my dying mother. But I still needed one more piece: evidence of Victoria's ongoing deception. That's where Russell Hendricks came in. Russell was a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud cases, and Catherine had worked with him dozens of times. If Victoria Blackwood is hiding assets or lying about her finances, Russell told me, I'll find it. People like her always get sloppy when they think they've gotten away with it. Russell's investigation revealed Victoria's secrets within 48 hours. She'd been married 4 times, not twice, as she'd told my father. Each marriage had ended with her systematically draining her husband's assets, then disappearing with liquidated accounts. She had active bank accounts in 3 states, a storage unit full of valuable items she'd inherited from previous husbands, and a gambling addiction that had gotten her banned from 2 casinos in Nevada. But the most damning discovery was her prescription drug abuse. Victoria had been doctor shopping across Phoenix, collecting OxyContin prescriptions from 6 different physicians using fake symptoms and forged medical records. The DEA was already investigating her for prescription fraud. They just needed someone to connect the dots. Your stepmother is a professional predator, Russell told me, handing over a thick file of evidence. She finds vulnerable families, exploits them during crisis periods, then moves on to the next target.
Your father isn't her husband. He's her mark. Armed with this evidence, Catherine filed a civil lawsuit that made local news headlines. Stepmother accused of stealing $2.3 million in jewelry from dying woman. But that was just the opening shot. The real war began when we served Victoria with papers at my father's house on North 32nd Street. I insisted on being there when it happened, not out of spite, but because I wanted to see her face when she realized her perfect crime had unraveled. Victoria answered the door in one of my mother's silk robes, a detail that made my blood boil but also provided perfect symbolism for what she'd done. She took the legal documents from the process server with trembling hands, and I watched her face go through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, recognition, fear, and finally, calculated rage. "Sophia," she said, her voice artificially sweet despite the legal papers in her hands, "there must be some misunderstanding. Your mother's jewelry was just costume pieces, sentimental value only. I donated the money to charity in her memory." Donated to charity? Even when caught red-handed, Victoria was still lying with the kind of confidence that had fooled my father for 2 years. But I wasn't my father, and I wasn't my dying mother. I was armed with evidence and absolutely done with her manipulation. "Victoria," I said, pulling out my phone to record the conversation, "that Cartier necklace you sold for $50 was authenticated by Sotheby's at $340,000. The Tiffany ring you sold for $75 was appraised at $180,000 just 6 months before my mother died. Would you like me to continue, or would you prefer to call your attorney?" The color drained from her face so completely that for a moment I thought she might faint. She'd spent months congratulating herself on the perfect crime, never imagining that my methodical mother had documented every single piece in her collection. "Those appraisals are fake," Victoria stammered. "Your mother was sick. She was confused about values. She probably paid scam artists to make her feel better about cheap jewelry." But her voice was shaking now, and we both knew she was trapped. "The appraisals are from Christie's, Sotheby's, and Heritage auctions," I replied calmly. "All dated and notarized, all backed up by insurance policies. Your insurance fraud investigator is very interested in reviewing." Insurance fraud investigator. That was the moment Victoria realized this wasn't just about stolen jewelry. This was about systematic financial fraud spanning multiple years and possibly multiple victims. My father, who had been listening from the hallway, finally appeared. "Sophia, what's going on? Victoria said you were having some kind of breakdown about your mother's old jewelry." Having a breakdown. Even with a federal lawsuit in her hands, Victoria was still trying to gaslight everyone around her, still trying to paint me as the unstable one while she was the reasonable victim of my emotional dysfunction.
"Dad," I said, handing him copies of the authentication documents, "Victoria stole $2.3 million in jewelry from Mom's estate and sold it to a pawn shop for $500. She forged probate documents, committed insurance fraud, and lied to you about donating the money to charity. The DEA is investigating her for prescription fraud, and the FBI is reviewing her pattern of marrying vulnerable men and stealing their assets." I watched my father read through the appraisals, watched him realize that the woman he'd brought into our home, the woman he'd chosen over his dying wife, the woman he'd been sleeping with in my mother's bed, was a professional con artist who'd been playing him from day one. "This can't be right," he said, but his voice was hollow. "Victoria, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't steal from Isabella." Victoria's response was to burst into tears, the kind of theatrical sobbing she'd probably used on 3 previous husbands. "David, you know me," she wailed. "I loved Isabella like a sister. I would never hurt her. Sophia is clearly having a psychotic break. She's making up these ridiculous stories because she can't accept that her mother is gone." Psychotic break. Professional con artists always have the same playbook: deny, deflect, and attack the credibility of anyone who threatens to expose them. But Victoria had made one critical mistake. She'd underestimated how thoroughly my mother had documented everything. "Dad," I said, pulling out my phone and showing him photos from the pawn shop, Here's the receipt from Murphy's Cash and Pawn, Victoria's signature, her driver's license number, and photographs of Mom's jewelry being sold for pocket change. Here's the probate violation. Victoria had no legal authority to sell estate assets. And here's the insurance fraud. Mom's policy specifically listed these pieces as high-value items worth millions. My father looked from the evidence to Victoria, then back to the evidence. I could see the exact moment when 2 years of manipulation crumbled, when he realized that the woman he'd trusted with his wife's legacy had betrayed that trust in the most devastating way possible. "Get out," he said quietly. "Victoria, get your things and get out of my house." But Victoria wasn't going quietly. "David, please," she begged. Isabella was confused about the jewelry's value. She was on so many medications, she wasn't thinking clearly. I thought I was helping by liquidating worthless items and donating the money. Sofia is twisting everything to make me look like a criminal. Twisting everything. Even with documented evidence of her crimes, Victoria was still trying to rewrite history, still trying to make my mother's careful planning seem like confusion, my evidence seem like delusion, my quest for justice seem like instability. But my father was done being manipulated. Isabella wasn't confused, he said, his voice getting stronger. She was the most methodical person I ever knew. If she had these pieces authenticated and appraised, it's because they were valuable. You stole from my wife, Victoria. You stole from my daughter. You stole from my family while pretending to care about us. That's when Victoria's mask finally slipped completely. Your wife was a pathetic, weak woman who wasted 20 years collecting shiny trinkets instead of living in the real world, she snarled. Your daughter is an ungrateful brat who can't accept that some people move on after death instead of wallowing in the past. And you're a spineless man who was so desperate for attention that you fell for the first woman who showed you any affection. There it was. Victoria's true opinion of our family, delivered with the kind of venom that revealed exactly who she'd always been underneath the helpful facade. My mother wasn't a woman who'd built a secret fortune. She was pathetic. I wasn't seeking justice for theft. I was ungrateful. My father wasn't a grieving widower. He was spineless. But Victoria had just made her biggest mistake. She'd revealed her true character in front of witnesses, with my phone recording every word. Catherine Williams was going to love this footage. You have 1 hour to pack your belongings and leave, my father told her. After that, I'm calling the police and having you removed for trespassing. And Victoria, don't take anything that belonged to Isabella. We'll be checking. Victoria's departure was swift and dramatic. She packed her designer clothes, her expensive makeup, and her prescription bottles into 3 suitcases, all while muttering about crazy families and ungrateful people. She left behind the silk robe that had belonged to my mother, probably because she finally realized it was evidence of her systematic erasure of my mother's identity. But I wasn't satisfied with just getting Victoria out of our house. I wanted justice, consequences, and public vindication for my mother's memory. The criminal case moved faster than anyone expected. The Maricopa County District Attorney's Office, armed with Russell's investigation and my mother's documentation, filed charges for grand theft, elder abuse, probate fraud, insurance fraud, and prescription drug fraud. Victoria was arrested at her apartment complex on East Camelback Road, led away in handcuffs while local news cameras recorded everything. The footage of her arrest became the lead story on every Phoenix news station. Local woman accused of stealing millions from dying stepmother, the headlines read. James Morrison's investigative piece in the Arizona Republic went viral, detailing Victoria's pattern of targeting vulnerable families and her sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation. But the civil case was where we really destroyed her. Catherine Williams filed a lawsuit seeking $4.6 million in damages, double the value of the stolen jewelry, plus punitive damages for psychological abuse, elder abuse, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Victoria's attorney, a overpriced defense lawyer named Richard Blackwood, who turned out to be her brother, tried to argue that my mother had been mentally incompetent when she created her documentation. It was a desperate strategy that backfired spectacularly when Dr. Rodriguez testified about my mother's medical records. Isabella Martinez was lucid, methodical, and psychologically sound throughout her illness, Dr. Rodriguez told the court. Her jewelry collection represents 20 years of careful research, authentication, and financial planning. The defendant's characterization of this as confusion is not only medically inaccurate, it's insulting to a woman who demonstrated remarkable intelligence and foresight even while battling terminal cancer. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They awarded us $6.8 million, the full value of the stolen jewelry, plus maximum punitive damages, plus attorney fees, plus a special award for exceptional cruelty in targeting a dying woman. But Victoria didn't have $6.8 million. What she did have was the storage unit full of items stolen from previous husbands, the secret bank accounts Russell had discovered, and a house in Tucson that she'd bought with money stolen from her third husband's estate. The asset seizure was poetry in motion. Federal marshals cleaned out Victoria's storage unit, finding jewelry, artwork, and collectibles worth over $400,000, all items she'd inherited from men who died shortly after marrying her. Her bank accounts in Arizona, Nevada, and California were frozen and liquidated. The house in Tucson was seized and sold at auction. Victoria tried to flee to Mexico, but was arrested at the border with $50,000 in cash and a suitcase full of fake identification documents. Apparently, this wasn't her first attempt at running from the consequences of her crimes. The criminal trial was a public spectacle that lasted 3 weeks. Victoria's defense team tried every strategy, claiming my mother was mentally incompetent, arguing that Victoria had been manipulated by my father, even suggesting that I had forged the authentication documents myself. Nothing worked. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Michael Santos, painted a clear picture of Victoria's predatory behavior. They brought in testimony from her previous husband's families, all of whom had similar stories of systematic financial abuse and emotional manipulation. They showed the jury photographs of my mother's jewelry collection next to the pawn shop receipts, creating a visual representation of Victoria's betrayal that left several jurors in tears. But the moment that sealed Victoria's fate came when the prosecution played the recording of her venomous outburst at my father's house. The jury heard her call my dying mother pathetic and weak, heard her dismiss 20 years of careful planning as wasting time on shiny trinkets, heard her reveal the contempt she'd been hiding behind 2 years of false compassion. Victoria Blackwood was convicted on all counts: grand theft, elder abuse, probate fraud, insurance fraud, prescription fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, calling her a predator who targets grieving families at their most vulnerable moments. But the real victory wasn't the prison sentence or the financial judgment. The real victory was watching my father finally understand what Victoria had done to our family. "I failed your mother," he told me the night after Victoria's sentencing. "I let that woman into our house, into our lives, into our most sacred spaces. I chose her over Isabella when Isabella was dying. I will regret that for the rest of my life." My father's guilt was heartbreaking, but it was also necessary. He needed to understand how his desperation for normalcy had made our family vulnerable to Victoria's manipulation. He needed to grieve not just my mother's death, but his own betrayal of her memory. But forgiveness is complicated, and healing takes time. My father and I started family therapy with Dr. Martinez, no relation, working through the layers of pain, guilt, and anger that Victoria had created in our family. We talked about my mother's secret planning, her quiet strength, her determination to protect me even while she was dying. "Your mother knew," Dr. Martinez told us. "She saw Victoria's true nature, understood what was happening, and created a plan to protect you from the consequences. She couldn't fight Victoria directly. She was too sick, too isolated, but she could outsmart her, and she did." Outsmarting Victoria became my mother's final gift to me. Not just the money, though the liquidated jewelry collection did allow me to buy a house, start a business, and build the kind of financial security my mother had always wanted for me.
The real gift was understanding that strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like patience, planning, and trusting that justice will eventually prevail. 6 months after Victoria's conviction, I used part of my inheritance to establish the Isabella Martinez Foundation for Elder Abuse Prevention. We provide legal assistance to families dealing with financial exploitation, education about the warning signs of elder abuse, and support for people recovering from predatory relationships.
Our first case was helping a 78-year-old widower whose new girlfriend had convinced him to sign over his house to her. Our investigation revealed that she'd done the same thing to 4 other elderly men, always targeting widowers within 6 months of their wives' deaths. She's now serving 8 years for elder abuse, and the family's recovered over $800,000 in stolen assets. But the Foundation's work isn't just about prosecution. It's about prevention. We teach families how to recognize manipulation tactics, how to protect vulnerable relatives, and how to document suspicious behavior. We partner with hospice organizations, senior centers, and hospitals to educate staff about the warning signs of financial exploitation. Most importantly, we honor the memory of people like my mother, intelligent, strategic, loving people who were systematically undermined by predators who mistook kindness for weakness. We make sure their stories are told, their planning is honored, and their sacrifices lead to protection for others. Every month, I get letters from people whose families have been targeted by predators like Victoria, adult children who notice their parents' belongings disappearing, elderly people who realize their new companions were more interested in their assets than their affection, healthcare workers who spotted warning signs of financial abuse. "Your mother's story saved my family," one woman wrote to me. "When my dad's new girlfriend started suggesting he update his will, I remembered your article and hired a private investigator. She'd already stolen $50,000 and was planning to take everything. Thank you for sharing your story." Thank you for sharing your story. That's what makes everything worthwhile. Knowing that my mother's experience, her planning, her sacrifice continues to protect other families from predators like Victoria. But the most healing moment came 18 months after Victoria's conviction, when my father and I were cleaning out the last of my mother's belongings from the house on North 32nd Street. We were preparing to sell it, too many painful memories, when I found something Victoria had missed. Hidden inside my mother's old recipe box, tucked behind her collection of index cards filled with our family's favorite dishes, was an envelope addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 1 week before she died. "My dearest Sophia, if you're reading this, then you've discovered the truth about Victoria and found the strength to fight for what's right. I'm so proud of you, though I know this journey has been painful. I want you to know that everything I did, the secret collection, the documentation, the planning, I did out of love for you and faith in your strength. Victoria thinks she's clever, but she's just greedy. Greedy people always get careless eventually, and careful people like us always win in the end. You are your mother's daughter, Sophia. You have my intelligence, my determination, and my absolute refusal to let bullies win. Use those gifts to protect yourself and others." The jewelry was never about the money, sweetheart. It was about giving you choices. The choice to be independent, to take risks, to help others, to build the life you want without having to depend on anyone else's approval or support. That's what every mother wants for her daughter, freedom to choose her own path. I know Victoria hurt you by making you watch me disappear from my own life, but you need to understand, I let her think she was winning because I was playing a longer game. Every day she spent congratulating herself on manipulating me was another day I spent protecting what really mattered. She got the house, the furniture, even your father's affection, but she never got you, and she never got the future I built for you. Live beautifully, Sophia. Love freely, trust carefully, and never let anyone make you feel small or invisible. You are the best part of my life, and everything I did was to make sure you could shine as brightly as you were meant to shine. All my love, always, Mom. P.S. The pearl necklace in the back of the box isn't documented with the others. It belonged to your great-great-grandmother and has no monetary value, but it has something better: history. Wear it when you need to remember that you come from a long line of strong women who protected what mattered most. I found the pearl necklace wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom of the recipe box. It was simple, old-fashioned, probably worth less than $50. But when I put it on, I felt connected to generations of women who'd faced difficult times and found ways to persevere. That necklace is what I was wearing when I gave my first speech at the National Conference on Elder Abuse Prevention.
when I testified before the Arizona State Legislature about strengthening laws against financial exploitation of seniors, when I accepted the award from the Phoenix District Attorney's Office for my work with the Isabella Martinez Foundation. Each time I touched those pearls and remembered my mother's words. You come from a long line of strong women who protected what mattered most. Victoria Blackwood is currently serving her sentence at Federal Correctional Institution Phoenix. She'll be eligible for release in 2034, when she's 68 years old. Her parole conditions include restitution payments to our family and the families of her other victims, prohibition from contact with anyone over 65 without court supervision, and mandatory participation in addiction treatment programs. She writes letters sometimes, apologetic letters claiming she's found religion, that she understands the harm she caused, that she wants to make amends. I don't read them. Catherine Williams handles all communication with Victoria and her attorneys, shielding me from any attempt at further manipulation.
Because that's what Victoria still doesn't understand. This was never about her. It was about my mother's legacy, my family's healing, and the protection of other vulnerable people from predators who mistake kindness for weakness. My father has remarried a wonderful woman named Grace, who knew my mother in high school and loved hearing stories about her intelligence, her humor, her quiet strength. Grace encourages my father to talk about my mother, to honor her memory, to acknowledge the ways Victoria's manipulation damaged our family. Your mother was remarkable, Grace tells me. The fact that she could plan so carefully for your future while fighting cancer and dealing with Victoria's psychological abuse, that takes incredible strength and intelligence. You should be proud to be her daughter. Proud to be her daughter. That's exactly what I am. Proud of her intelligence, her planning, her refusal to let Victoria's cruelty defeat her love for me. Proud of the legacy she left. Not just the money, but the example of how to fight for what matters most. Today, I live in a house I bought with my mother's gift, run a foundation that bears her name, and wear her great-great-grandmother's pearls whenever I need to remember where my strength comes from. Victoria took 2 years of my mother's life, but she couldn't take my mother's love, her planning, or her determination to protect me. If you're watching this and thinking about someone in your family who might be vulnerable to financial predators, trust your instincts. Document everything. Ask questions. Don't let politeness prevent you from protecting people you love. And remember, sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to let them be taken advantage of. The predators are counting on your silence, your politeness, your reluctance to cause family drama. They're counting on you being too nice to fight back. But nice people don't always win. Smart people do. Persistent people do. People who refuse to let bullies destroy what matters most. My mother taught me that strength isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet and patient and strategic. Sometimes it looks like letting your enemy think they've won while you're actually 10 moves ahead. Victoria Blackwood thought she'd destroyed my mother and stolen her legacy. Instead, she gave my mother the motivation to build something that will protect vulnerable families for generations. She thought she was silencing a weak, dying woman. Instead, she created a story that's been shared millions of times, warning other families about predators just like her. So here's my message to anyone who's watching this and thinking about targeting vulnerable families. We're watching you. We're documenting everything. We're sharing information and protecting each other. And we're a lot smarter and stronger than you think we are. To everyone else, the children of aging parents, the families dealing with a crisis, the people who've lost someone they loved, your stories matter. Your memories matter. Your fight for justice matters. Don't let anyone convince you to stay quiet about abuse, theft, or manipulation. Share your story in the comments below. Tell me about the people you've lost, the predators you've encountered, the battles you fought. I read every single comment, and your experiences help other families recognize warning signs and protect themselves. My mother always said that beautiful jewelry tells stories, stories of love, celebration, heritage, and hope.
Victoria tried to turn those stories into quick cash for drug money, but she couldn't steal the most important story of all, the story of a mother's love that was stronger than death, smarter than deception, and more powerful than any predator who tried to destroy it. That story lives on in every family we help, every predator we expose, every vulnerable person we protect. That's my mother's real legacy, not the money, but the reminder that love always finds a way to win. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about justice. And thank you for remembering that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let someone else's cruelty have the final word. Victoria Blackwood wanted my family's silence. Instead, she got the most public exposure of her crimes imaginable. She wanted my mother forgotten. Instead, she made my mother's story immortal. That's what happens when you underestimate a mother's love and a daughter's determination. You don't just lose. You become a cautionary tale about what happens to predators who target the wrong family. My name is Sofia Martinez. I'm 30 years old, and I'm proof that sometimes the best revenge is living beautifully while making sure the people who hurt you face the consequences of their choices. Justice isn't always immediate, but it's always possible. Never give up fighting for what is right.